Hello everyone, and welcome to China-US Focus. With us today is Dr. Richard Weitz, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and an expert on China-US relations. Dr. Weitz, thanks so much for being with us here today. Let's get started with the first question. North Korea's recent nuclear test has called into question the future of the relationship between Beijing and Pyongyang. How do you envision this relationship moving forward?
Well, China is admittedly in a difficult situation. They certainly do not want North Korea to have nuclear weapons. They don't like the tests and the provocative behavior of North Korea. It harms Chinese interests. I mean, what happens is the North Koreans make a threat, and detonate a nuclear device, launch a long-range missile. In response, South Korea, Japan, the United States cooperate more, build up their own forces, engage in military exercises. And the Chinese are worried about a war breaking out. They're worried that what the steps that the U.S. and its allies take are going to hurt Chinese security. And so we share this common interest in dampening down North Korean behavior. But there is a fundamental difference. The United States and Japan, everything being equal, would like to see a change in regime in North Korea, just a government that has better respect for its people, that's less aggressive and so on. I think the Chinese like to see a change in the policies of the regime, but not a change in the regime itself. So what they're trying to do is they try and say, look, this is the path we took, we evolved, we moved away from Maoism, we reformed the economy, we reformed our foreign policy, and look how successful we've been. But so far that example hasn't taken. And the Chinese are reluctant to move too closely to the United States and on the North Korean issue because they can envision all sorts of bad things happening, that if the regime falls or turns against China, all the interests that China could see suffer in the consequence. So we're sort of a bit of a dilemma. We know what we want to avoid, which is war and conflict, and we know where we'd like North Korea to be, which was a less aggressive state without nuclear weapons and missiles. But when push comes to shove, the U.S. is willing to take actions that could perhaps lead to a little bit of instability to try and weaken the regime, whereas the Chinese refuse to do that. And so when I try and talk with the Chinese on Korean issues, they're reluctant to talk about it with foreigners because it's such a sensitive issue.
Mm-hmm. And given that fundamental difference, are there any ways that the United States and China can cooperate to ensure the stability of the Korean Peninsula?
There's been some cooperation in the UN Security Council. There's been some cooperation on sanctions. There's a dialogue through the six-party talks. There's just a limit to what I think China will do that the United States would like to see done. So I don't think they would enforce all the sanctions that we would like them to enforce. I don't think that they would cut off various assistance to the North Korean government if they thought it could weaken their influence in Pyongyang even further or threaten the regime. So we can get some help, but really China can't give us Pyongyang, can't deliver that problem and solve it for us.
Xi Jinping just completed his first trip overseas as president of China. What key takeaways did you see from this trip?
Well, it was very interesting. He certainly made statements which were stronger than I would have anticipated, particularly in Moscow. He made statements very critical of, he didn't mention the U.S. by name, but you can certainly interpret those remarks as I did, being directed at the U.S. about unilateralism, about the missile defense problems, about the need for Russia and China to cooperate and maintain a global balance. And it was very, very direct. And so that was interesting. It helps me understand a bit better what his views are. And certainly, I think it makes us think that the China-Russia relationship could become stronger than has been in the past and than we thought might be possible. With respect to Africa and the BRIC trip, I haven't seen anything particularly that strikes me. There's a lot of commentary, of course, about his wife having such a prominent role, though unlike the United States and Western Europe, the Chinese have sort of backed off from the First Lady syndrome since they had the problems with Mao's wife trying to lead basically, as you recall, what she carried on the radical front and tried to prevent China from taking what I think many people would see as a corrective action after Mao's death to moderate some of its policies, and so they ended up having to put her in prison. So and since then, they've been wary of giving the First Lady a political role. But in this case, the First Lady had a career like Hillary Clinton had a career on her own before, she became married and became became prominent through as she's wife. I believe that she was better known than he was until maybe a year or two ago.
Okay. And specifically with regards to Russia, in a recent piece that you wrote for China U.S. Focus, you stated that Beijing is quite comfortable deferring to Moscow's lead when it comes to issues related to Central Asia. Do you believe that China will continue to work peacefully with Moscow to support the development of this region?
Yeah, just to clarify, they're comfortable deferring the security of the region. So China has not have a permanent base in Central Asia. They will engage in periodic exercises there, but a small number of forces, and then they leave. They are comfortable with Russia having the dominant security role there. They are very vigorous on the economic front, and the Russians, whether they like it or not, have accommodated themselves to the fact that China will be a major economic actor. There's not really much they can do about that in the region, given its proximity to China and given the strength of the Chinese economy. You could imagine some scenarios in which China would want to revise that arrangement if Russia proved unable to maintain security in the region. If there was, for example, an outbreak of chaos and revolution or state failure, and Russia failed to intervene to stop it, if there was a rise of a terrorist movement there that was encouraging terrorism within China, maybe among the Uyghurs, you could see that as a dynamic that might cause them to intervene more. How Afghanistan, what happens in Afghanistan after 2014, that could also have a big impact on the evolution of the relationship. But for the most part, I think the Chinese would prefer that Russia handle security and they concentrate on the economics.
Great. In Xi's tour of Tanzania, South Africa, and the Republic of Congo, sought to pay tribute to the relationship between China and Africa. As China is now Africa's largest trading partner, how can China counter the accusations of neocolonialism?
Well, the Chinese, to their credit, they're willing to invest large amounts of money in large infrastructure projects that Western groups, even international financial institutions, would not, because the return is iffy and it's they're massive projects and you could lose a lot of money. They're willing to do that. They're willing to invest in the kind of infrastructure that some of these African countries want and need because it'll benefit them as well, the local people, because they can then, it makes it easier to transport the resources to China. On the other hand, China has been criticized on several dimensions. One, they don't impose severe, compared to what other groups do, they don't impose major economic conditions on their loans or political conditions. So they will lend money to countries that can then take that money and then get out of the kind of conditions that the IMF might demand in terms of their reforming their budgets, reducing corruption, becoming more democratic, and so on. There's the fact that what happened initially, China could only had close ties with those countries which didn't have close ties with the West, so they ended up with allied to a group of very not very popular governments in Sudan, Zimbabwe, others. They've since broadened from that. Some of the Chinese corporations have not treated the Africans well, and in the sense that they'll often bring in managers from China. They often, what they do is, my impression is they treat the African workers the same way as they treat the Chinese workers at home, which is not, it's a standard. It can be demanding, work many hours, and so many Africans find that uncomfortable. But that said, the Africans clearly, everything on balance, would welcome China's growing economic role. And so I think if they can take corrective actions to address perhaps what the private companies are doing, and if the government takes a greater role in trying to control that, if they can work a bit closer with the international financial institutions, a bit closer with Western governments to make sure that governments can't play off China and the West to evade necessary reforms, I think that could help.